Today, our speaker, Dr. Charles McClean, is joining us from Newport, Connecticut, and I'll just very briefly introduce him before he starts. So he's the Japan Foundation Postdoctoral Associate at Yale University's Council on East Asian Studies. And prior to that, he was the Toyota Visiting Professor at the University of Michigan's Center for Japanese Studies, and he was also a postdoc at Harvard in their US-Japan Relations Program. He's published in a number of journals, and he's currently working on this book called Silver Democracy, Youth Representation in an Aging Japan, which is presumably covering the issues that we're going to be talking about today. So, Charles, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for having me here today. Let me just share my slides, make sure you can all see it.
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, great. Well, again, thanks. Delighted to be here to talk about my book project, talk about youth political representation in an aging Japan. So in many countries, politicians are often significantly older than the average constituent that they represent. So we could think about here in the United States, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. In the last presidential election, these were the oldest candidates in US history, with Biden going on to then become the oldest president in US history. And at least right now, it seems like we might be gearing for a rematch. And if we think about Japan, a topic of today, think about the last two prime ministers. Yoshihide Suga was the oldest prime minister in about 30 years, and he was succeeded by Fumio Kishida, the younger, though still in his mid-60s, prime minister. So for those of us who follow US politics or follow Japanese politics, this type of gerontocracy, where leaders tend to be significantly older, sometimes called silver democracy in Japan, seems very natural, not just in the president's office or the prime minister's office, not just at the top level of government, but really across all positions throughout the country. And while it's true that young people are underrepresented in political institutions across the world, it turns out that they are especially underrepresented in the US and Japan. So here, what I'm showing you now are all of the OECD countries, and the y-axis is the percentage of the members of parliament in the lower or unicameral chamber who are under 40 years old. And so there's actually quite a range, but Japan and the US rank second and third to last in the OECD in the percentage of MPs under 40. Japan has less than 5% of its members under 40, compared to, say, the UK, which falls right in the middle at about 21, 22%, or countries like Denmark, where more than 40% of members are under 40. And in this book and in my broader research, I think both about how we might explain this variation and also whether it's potentially concerning. There are many issues that disproportionately affect young people, issues like childcare, education, unemployment. Young people also stand to be disproportionately affected by longer-term challenges like climate change and declining birth rates. And so without more young people in public office, there's at least a worry that the policies enacted by mostly older politicians could be detrimental to both the short and longer-term interests of younger generations. And if we just looked at some cross-national correlations for a second, we might see some indication that this is the case. So here now, what I'm showing you on the x-axis is that MPs under 40, and the y-axis here is a measure of sort of elderly to children spending, the ratio of social spending on elderly per capita to children per capita. So countries that tend to elect more older politicians, like Japan and the US, fewer younger politicians, also tend to spend much more on the elderly relative to how much they spend on children. All countries spend more on the elderly per capita than they do on children, though countries like Sweden, Denmark, the ratio is 3 to 4 times. In Japan and the US, for decades, it's been much closer to 20 times. So the book really is thinking about two questions again. The first is, why are younger politicians so rare in some electoral contexts and not others? Why are they so rare in Japan? And the second is, does it matter? Or what are the consequences of youth underrepresentation for social policy? Do younger politicians promote fundamentally different social policies when they're elected to office? I'm going to talk about both of these topics today and give kind of a broader overview of the book and present some of the evidence from my ongoing book project. But this is very much in progress, and so I'm really looking forward to the conversation and any ideas you may have. But for today, I'm hoping that I can sort of convey 3 broad takeaways. The first is that gerontocracy or silver democracy is not destiny. And what I mean by this is that it's sometimes assumed that a growing share of older voters are going to elect more and more older candidates, and that policies important to young people are doomed. But today what I'm going to try and argue is that really Japan's civil democracy is sustained much more by institutions than it is by older voters, who are actually quite supportive of having young people serve as their representatives. The second idea is that a politician's age can be fundamental, can be pivotal in shaping their preferences for social spending. And so I'm going to talk about work I've done showing that younger politicians promote and implement, when given the chance, significantly different policies that allocate greater social spending to young families with children. Interestingly, younger politicians spend more on children, but they're very, very hesitant to reduce spending on the elderly. They pull from other areas of the budget. We could talk more about how they fund those spending increases on children, but they don't cut costs on the elderly, which suggests that greater youth representation may not necessarily exacerbate intergenerational conflict. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So let's start with Japan's civil democracy. As I said again, my argument is really that Japan's civil democracy is sustained by institutions, not older voters, not elderly voters, as is often assumed. I think many of us here in this audience are probably quite familiar with this chart or something similar to it, perhaps a population pyramid, this idea that Japan's population is rapidly aging, that since the 1970s, the percentage of people who are 65 and over has increased fourfold, while the number of children has fallen by half. And now we have well over a quarter, I think it's 29% of the population is 65 and over. So a greater and greater share of the population is being populated by older people, and a greater and greater share of voters are older. And so the concern, as often said in the media or by other experts, is that more and more older voters, coupled with declining youth turnout, is going to make politicians really cater to the elderly. So here, what I'm showing you is turnout by age groups, with the people in their 20s highlighted in bright red and people in their 60s highlighted in bright blue. I need to add 2021, but it's a very similar trend. We see that actually young people used to turn out to vote at very similar rates to the elderly in the late 60s, or much closer rates, but that gap has widened over time. And so again, there is this worry that as young people become a smaller share, as they turn out to vote less and less, we're going to have more and more concerns about intergenerational inequality, that older politicians are going to ignore social policies or pay less attention to social policies that are important to young people. Here is an example of sort of a protest that arose. It was back in 2016. A woman wrote on a blog post in Japan. I think the blog post was titled something like "Die Japan Die," and basically she had unfortunately been unable to find like a daycare spot for her child. This is this problem that many of you may be familiar with about long wait lists for public daycare, and that her and her spouse have been, having all these issues. And when asked about it, an older politician said, well, this is a blog post, and so we don't really know if this person is real. We can't really verify this information. This led to protests where people came out in front of the Dai building here, both men and women, and you see their signs, for those of you who read Japanese. It says, Hoikuren ochita no watashi da. Like basically, I am one of the people that failed to get this daycare spot, right? So there's a growing concern that older politicians are going to ignore social policies favored by younger people. And what I talk about in the book is both that the younger politicians focus on different social policies, but also that actually older voters are very supportive of voting for young candidates. So I have lots of different types of evidence in the book. I'm just showing you a kind of picture of one type of thing that I do, which are these face manipulation experiments where I present, Japanese respondents with hypothetical candidates where I've manipulated their perceived age and see how they judge their suitability for office, the types of issues they might focus on, and really, whether it's in an experimental setting, or I also collect, as I'll talk about in a minute, data on local elections, on national elections in Japan, and look at the actual voter turnout, the actual votes that candidates receive. It turns out that younger candidates, receive about as many votes, and voters are quite positive toward having younger candidates. In this particular experiment, they judge younger and sort of middle-aged looking candidates as equally favorable. And actually, voters dislike elderly looking candidates. There's strong dislike of older candidates, but strong support for younger candidates. And even older voters are very supportive of having younger candidates. They see them as likely to focus on different policy issues, as more competent than much older ones, even though they have less experience. And so there isn't like a lot of evidence to suggest that, I don't know, a growing bias, anti-young bias among a growing share of older voters is really the driving force behind youth underrepresentation. And instead, what I focus on in the first half of the book is arguing much more that it's Japan's institutions. That Japan's institutions have created a setting where, compared to other countries, young people really just face disproportionately higher costs to running for office. These types of costs come in two kinds of flavors. One is that Japan has, much higher barriers that distinctly affect younger people. So compared to other countries, Japan has pretty high minimum ages of candidacy, whereas there's many countries like the UK where you can run for office at 18. In Japan, you have to be 25 to run for most offices, including local offices, and you need to be 30 to run for governor or the upper house. It isn't necessarily the case that, if you reduce these barriers, you're going to see lots of 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old members of parliament. That isn't necessarily the main effect of these barriers. It's also this delay in political socialization, this delay in thinking about politics as a career and thinking about, that the government wants to see young people represented, these symbolic effects. So this is part of it. The other kinds of barriers are that barriers that can similarly affect younger and older people, but younger people just have much fewer resources to overcome them. So Japan's electoral institutions really put a heavy burden on individuals compared to parties to accumulate significant resources, financial resources, networks, local experience to be able to win elections. And these resources are the ones that individuals tend to accrue with age. It's very difficult, in a situation where elections are extremely costly on the individual, it's tough for young people to be able to get those kinds of resources at a young age and be able to run for office. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit less today, but it also greatly affects the type of young person who can run for office, right? What type of young person is actually going to have these significant resources? Well, they're going to be wealthier. And in Japan, they're also much more likely, say, to be second or third generation politicians, right? Be part of political families. So it both limits the number and affects the type. I just wanted to show a little bit, just some cross-national patterns, just to sort of show some evidence for this, but we can talk much more in the discussion about other areas that I look at. So, for example, here is just looking at cross-national differences in the minimum age of candidacy. Here I've expanded the sample to 68 democracies, not just OECD countries. The y-axis is that percent of MPs who are under 40, and the x-axis is whether the minimum age is 18, 21, or 25, Japan being in the 25 category. This is just a simple comparison, like difference in means. It holds up if we did sort of more complicated regression analysis. But here I just wanted to show that on average, countries with lower minimum ages have about twice as many people who are under 40 years old in the parliament. And this is not just that 18 to 25 category. They also have significantly more in that 25 to 39 category, again, because people get socialized into politics, think about political careers at an earlier stage. By comparison, younger MPs are also much less common in sort of majoritarian and mixed electoral systems than they are in PR systems. So Japan technically has a mixed electoral system for the lower house, but we could get into the details, but the type of mixed system it has really encourages candidates to behave much more like majoritarian candidates. And again, it really has an electoral system that puts that onus on the individual. Countries like that, again, far fewer young MPs, whereas countries with proportional representation, countries where parties play a much greater role, not just in recruiting candidates, but in providing support for them, where candidates don't run for single member districts, but they're part of party lists, where parties have incentives to present a diverse slate of candidates on their lists. We see much more young candidates. Whereas again, those single member districts where it's really up to the individual, far fewer. So Japan has these two types of main systems, but I'd love to talk more about it again in the discussion. And right now, this is the part of the book I'm kind of finishing up. So I'm trying to think much more specifically about local institutions as well, and thinking about very specific institutions that affect youth representation. And what I just want to share right now is that to date, a lot of work, both scholars, experts, and media coverage, I often see this assertion that the way to increase young people running for office, particularly local office in Japan, is to increase the benefits of holding office, to increase the salaries they receive in office. And the phrase I often see is, you can't like raise a family on the salary that is given to people who hold office. This is a separate issue, but sometimes there's sort of a gendered component to this where there's a very clear assumption that the only person working in the household is the politician. But in this case, in my own work, what I found is that might make some sense. And of course, there might be benefits to like increasing the salaries that politicians receive. But in my own work, what I found is that increasing salaries much more often has a stronger impact on incumbency ratings. The value that individuals see to holding office, to running for re-election, which tends to crowd out younger candidates. And so there's actually often a negative correlation between salary levels and how many young people run for office. And what I've been finding is that both in surveys and in other work, that efforts to sort of reduce the costs of running for office seem to have a much greater impact on getting young people to run. So we could think about efforts like public funding. Japan has public funding, but it has this tricky minimum candidate deposit system where candidates are required to put up a significant amount of money that they lose if they don't get enough votes. There's also been lots of discussion about this candidate leave and reinstatement system, especially for local elections in Japan, which is that in Japan's labor market is very rigid. And young people are very worried that if they leave their jobs to run for office, they're basically going to be excluded from returning to their company. And it's going to have a huge impact. And it's hard to win an election that's costly and where incumbency rates are high. And so efforts to allow so that companies can give younger employees temporary leave to run for office, but their position is protected. This seems to have, at least in the minds of young people, a much greater impact on their decision to run than, say, an increase in the salary. But again, happy to talk more in the discussion, get more into the details about this. I just want to leave time to cover both the sort of why are young people underrepresented and in Japan, it's so underrepresented in Japan and doesn't matter. So let's shift now, thinking a bit more about local politics too, and thinking about, does it matter? Does this youth underrepresentation have consequences for the types of social policies that get enacted? Would electing more younger politicians perhaps have an impact on how Japan deals with these issues like declining birth rates and aging population? So my fundamental argument is yes, I find that younger politicians are much more likely to promote social spending on child welfare for younger families. And as I'll talk about in a minute too, this is especially through things like greater investment, longer term investment. At the local level, it's things like building new daycare centers to tackle some of those issues like the daycare waiting list. I mentioned here, so I started cross-national and now we're going local. In the book, I focus much more on local, but I just sort of wanted to start with that cross-national. But in the book, I focus a lot on mayors, because mayors play this really crucial role in making decisions over social spending, and because there's great variety, great variation across Japan in sort of the level of benefits that are provided. So here is an example of a couple of younger mayors who have volunteered to work at a local daycare center. The picture, unfortunately, kind of cuts it off, but on the right-hand side here, there's actually, it's a photo op, right? So the kids don't seem that happy necessarily to be in the photo, but there's a huge range of photo cameras also sort of taking pictures of them volunteering. And what's important about like focusing on mayoral offices is over half of like social spending of Japan's social spending is really administered at the local level, especially if we ignore pensions. So mayors have these critical capacity to sort of make policy decisions about building new daycare centers, about implementing policies that make it easier to raise children, implementing policies that tackle issues, including like unemployment. And the great thing about focusing on mayors is that there are these executives with policy discretion. Both younger and older people in this office can have at least theoretically a similar capacity to influence public policy, which makes it easier for me to sort of link a person's age to the policies they would promote. Whereas in the Diet, in the parliament, these younger politicians are going to be backbenchers. They have much less influence over policy. So to really look at how a person's age affects their policy preferences, mayors are a great case. Also, in local elections and in mayor elections, most mayors are independents. They run at least officially. They do often have ties to the LDP, but they run at least officially as independents, which limits some of the effect of political parties. The challenge about looking at local elections in Japan, and a big part of this book, has been that for a long time, those of us who focus on Japanese politics have been blessed by having wonderful, detailed data at the national level. We haven't had great data on local elections, on local candidates. And so this has been the big project that I've been working on, is to collect through a variety of sort of online portals and newspapers, collect data on mayoral and municipal assembly candidates and build this sort of Japan municipal elections data set to just better document how young people are underrepresented at the local level. So right now, this has over 200,000 candidates and nearly 20,000 elections covering about a 20-year period. I have data on sort of their names, their age, gender, partisanship, incumbency, vote totals, and turnout. And then focusing on mayors, I've also been collecting data on their family structure, on whether they have children, what were they doing before running for mayor, and what types of party support they received. So again, I know we're covering a lot, trying not to go too fast, happy to focus on more specific parts. But I just wanted to show you a little bit. This is showing you from my data set the age distribution of voters in light gray compared to mayors in dark gray, the voting age population here. And so we see that while half the voting age population is relatively even distributed, the median voter or age among the voting age population, the median person is 50, whereas the median mayor starts their term at age 62. It always looks to me almost like an island or a volcano coming out of the sea. But the average mayor in Japan, it's often the office that the person has, it's much more often the office that a person has toward the very end of their career than toward the beginning, right? Only 10% of elected mayors are under 50. Half are in their 60s or older. And so this crucial office, right, that makes decisions about social policy, about social spending, is overwhelmingly occupied by middle-aged and older people, and very rarely occupied by younger people. Now, I use a certain kind of method in the book to sort of get closer to what we might call causally identifying the effect of electing a younger person on social spending. And I didn't want to spend too much time here getting into those details, but I just wanted to give a quick overview of the results that I find, and then also sort of like the intuition behind what I do. So the challenge has often been when we look at these local politics that basically we could compare spending differences in municipalities that have younger mayors with municipalities that have older mayors. But those municipalities are going to differ in all sorts of ways, not just whether they have a younger or older mayor, right? They might differ in their age demographics, and importantly, in their previous social spending, their preferences, and importantly, all these factors are also factors that would affect how much they spend on children, perhaps, to how much they spend on the elderly. And so the challenge is, how do we know that it's really the mayor's age that's doing the work? So in this part, I talked about using experiments in the first part of the book. In this part, I use something that's called a regression discontinuity design. But just the intuition of it is basically that I look at these really, really close elections between younger and older candidates. Before I was looking, say, at candidates who were under 40 as young. For mayors, I sometimes focus on under 50. Again, just sort of focusing on that median age of the voter. But they're very similar results for other age breakups. So I look at these really, really close elections in municipalities. And the idea is that municipality that just barely elects a young person mayor is really similar to the municipality that just barely elects the older person mayor, and differs only in whether they got that younger or older mayor. And so from a political science perspective, this idea is that it's getting closer to holding constant all those other factors. And I could show you tables that show these municipalities are really, really similar. We're just looking at this small difference of whether they got the young mayor or not. And so here, I don't want to go too much into it, but the x-axis is showing the vote margin, and what's changing at the vertical line is whether or not the young candidate won. So to the right of these vertical lines, the young candidate wins. To the left, they lose. And the y-axis looks at this change in spending on child welfare or change in spending in elderly welfare. And so when we look at these things called RDDs, what we're looking for visually is a jump. We want to see that municipality that just barely elected the young person mayor spends a lot more on children. The one that doesn't spends a lot less. And so we're looking for this sort of like a visual jump. And so if I plot it, that is actually what we see. But really the takeaway point to this is that I find that when a municipality narrowly elects a young person mayor, compared to the ones that narrowly elect the old person mayor, they spend significantly more on child welfare. And what was really interesting to me is that they greatly increase spending on children, but they're very hesitant to take spending away from the elderly. I actually talked to one younger mayor who was considering reducing funding on elderly spending, but he got together members of the local shop owners, like Shotengai Association, and kind of said, like, would you be willing to accept less welfare to help fund greater spending on children? You could imagine how that conversation went. Didn't go so far, but a hesitation. They don't seem to cut spending on the elderly, but they do increase spending on children. How do they manage this? Well, they increase the overall social welfare budget. They cut other non-welfare related spending to help fund this. And they also sometimes, I'll talk about in a minute, issue greater sort of like municipal bonds, partly to fund these new daycare centers, which is interesting in itself because it suggests that they're more willing to take on debt, which again puts some of the costs of sort of spending more on child welfare, on investing in child welfare, more on younger generations as well, shifting the costs. They're not, say, increasing taxes in the short term on the elderly. They're instead issuing more bonds, taking on greater debt. But again, let's talk more about this. But this key finding is that this increase more on child welfare, hesitant to cut spending on elderly welfare. In the book, I focus on sort of what is it about young mayors, especially that kind of shifts their preferences toward representing younger families with children. And I find that the effects that I just showed you are much stronger among those young mayors who are at that time really raising young children. They have this recent personal experience raising young children, and in conversations with them, they often cite this experience. They talk about how personally their own family failed to, say, get a spot for the public daycare in their city, the challenges that they and their spouse are facing in raising children, and how personal it is to them. So I think that's certainly an important dimension. Second dimension that I just had to, unfortunately didn't have time to really cover in greater detail today, is this idea that maybe younger politicians are also more concerned with this, declining birth rates, this longer term challenges, because it's going to be younger generations that greatly bear the burden of Japan's, the welfare crisis, or the issues concerning the sustainability of the welfare system that are coming from population aging. And so I also find that spending that's coming is predominantly geared toward the long term. In fact, I even find that younger mayors are willing to sort of cut shorter term benefits, immediate benefits. They reduce a little bit the amount that's given out in the present immediately to families because they want to fund these longer term investments in their cities. They build daycare centers, they tackle that daycare waiting list, but they also build these childcare centers in order to, in the hopes of kind of reversing population decline in their municipalities and encouraging more young people to move to their municipalities. And so in the book, I talk about how maybe it's not just their, the life stage that a politician is at that may shape their preferences, but also this idea that they have longer time horizons, this idea that they're perhaps more concerned about some of these future challenges that are going to disproportionately affect young people. So again, I know that I've covered a lot relatively quickly, and I'm hoping that in the discussion, we'll talk more about whatever was particularly interesting to you. Grateful for any feedback you have as I try to finish up this project. To repeat those three main takeaways. So I wanted to start by saying that in my argument, gerontocracy or silver democracy is not destined. By which I mean it's not inevitable. It's driven more by Japan's institutions than it is by a sort of anti-young bias among older voters with greater turnout. And what's important here is that institutions can be reformed. Institutions that reduce the cost, this disproportionate cost that younger candidates are facing, that younger political aspirants are facing. I provide evidence the book can have a significant impact on affecting young people running for office, which in turn can have a significant impact on the social policies that get implemented by governments. I tried to talk a little bit about how I find that a politician's age can be pivotal in shaping their preferences for social spending, showing you an example of young mayors in Japan. In the book, I also looked, young MPs, for example, are much more likely to say that if elected, they will prioritize education, they will prioritize unemployment, they will prioritize child welfare. So I just wanted to give you a concrete example because I think it's crucial to focus on mayors because they have this actual capacity to influence actual spending. And so I showed you that it can, when a municipality elects a young person mayor, it can have this fundamental impact on how much they spend, how much they invest in childcare spending. But at the same time, while they greatly increase spending on children, again, they're hesitant to cut funding on the elderly. And so in my view, perhaps the positive side to this may be that it might not exacerbate intergenerational conflicts. It might help us understand why older voters are okay with having or supportive of having younger candidates because they don't view them as likely to take away or cut their spending. And they don't mind that the welfare budget as a whole is increasing. This isn't to suggest that younger politicians are some, perfect candidate and that they have no cost to them. I find that they do cut other areas of the budget. They cut that short-term spending to focus on long-term investment. And in some cases too, they also increase debt, issue more municipal bonds in order to fund these investments. As I talked about, this is part of a book project. The book is titled Silver Democracy, Youth Representation in Aging Japan. Really looking forward to the conversation and thank you so much for having me here today.